Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 378 of Humanity Rising. Hope you had a good weekend. It's wonderful to be in this December period. I just want to note that at the end of this week, on the 10th of December, we're going to take a break as we did last year, as we all go into a little bit of a hibernation here in the Northern Hemisphere. In the beginnings of spring in the Southern Hemisphere, and really tend to home and hearth. So we have a very full series of programs, but over the next couple of days, we also want to begin to bring closure on the year. 2021 has been epic in many, many ways, not only in terms of the pandemic, which is in many ways getting worse, not better, but in terms of climate and the declaration by the supreme climate scientists and Secretary General that we are now in code red, that we are now in the climate tipping point. So it's been a very eventful year. Also in terms of race, and the turbulence that continues to plague, particularly the United States, around the issue of race. You all remember last year with George Floyd and the reverberations of that event that has just both troubled and challenged the global psyche as people all around the world have contemplated this issue in a way and with a starkness that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. So there's been a lot happening during 2021, and how we assess it and what we do about it, what we do together about the reality that we are now in is a central thematic, I would say, an impulse for Humanity Rising. So over the next 5 days, we'll be contemplating these matters as a container for the various discussions that we're going to have. As we begin our program today, let us pause, as we always do, and just take a moment in all the hustle and bustle and just center yourself in your body. Take a breath. If you can, just close your eyes and attune yourself with your heart in whatever way you do that, in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Heart coherence may be the most important thing we do each day. Thank you, everyone. As I was contemplating my heart, I was just realizing more deeply than usual the importance of heart coherence. You know, with all the chaos and turbulence and divisiveness and trauma in our world, the only way through this thicket is by creating in ourselves and in our community an island of coherence. If we can do that, and if our coherence is deep enough and wide enough and loving enough to embrace all the chaos that we're experiencing, we have the possibility for transformation. So I just want to honor these moments of heart coherence each day. As I say, it may be the most important thing that we do, because the how of what we do is emerging in this time of escalating turbulence as, if not even more important than the what of what we do. Because if whatever we do is not in a spirit of coherence and love, then what's the point? What's the point? So today we want to go back into the issue of race again, almost coterminous with Humanity Rising and the pandemic was the death of George Floyd. And as I indicated, that has reverberated around the world. More people came out in manifestation in that period, in the aftermath of his death, than any time in recorded history. It was the largest manifestation we know of around a single event. And so we wanted to return to it today with a woman, Milagros Phillips, who was actually born in the Dominican Republic. That's where Christopher Columbus landed in October 12th, 1492. So it was the epicenter for race, for trauma in many, many ways. She came to the United States. She's written 4 books. She consults with companies and with organizations all around the world around race literacy. How do you develop in a corporate or institutional framework the kind of awareness, respect for diversity, inclusion of diversity? This is what Milagros does. I had the recent pleasure of discovering her and meeting her. So Milagros, welcome. We're on a little bit of a short time frame. We've got just about 50 minutes before she has to move on to another appointment. But Milagros, just want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. And why don't we start? We'd love to just hear your story, just to introduce yourself to our global community, about who you are and how you came to really focus on race literacy and what particular aspects of this very complex reality and anthropology around race that you focused in on, and how you lead people to a better understanding of honoring the diversity that characterizes our humanity. So welcome, and tell us a little about yourself and make a little presentation, then I'll circle back for the balance of the time and we'll have a dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me to be here with you today. And thank you to your audience and everyone who's listening and who cares so much about this topic. So I did not come to this work lightly. In fact, I resisted this work pretty much most of my life. I actually got my calling on the day that Dr. King died. I was watching television with my father, and when they made the announcement that Dr. King had passed away, I locked myself in the bathroom to cry because I was so upset. And I literally heard a voice that I was to continue the work. I had no idea what that meant. I'm 13 years old at the time. And so for the most part, what I did was I resisted the work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. I'm going to enlarge my presentation here so that you can see it a little bit better. And I'm going to move myself out of my own way in more ways than one. and tell you a little bit about my background. So I was born in the land where the Middle Passage began. A lot of people don't realize that the Middle Passage actually began in the Dominican Republic, where they started to take Africans from the African continent to what is now known as the Dominican Republic. It was then known as Quisqueya. There were a lot of Tainos living on that land, and they had brought in the Africans to work in the sugar cane plantations. I always tell people that I've experienced racism in at least 2 languages. And I also tend to look at race as both an insider and an outsider. An insider because people look at me and they make assumptions about what I look like. They think they know where I was born and my first language and so on and so forth. And I also look at it as an outsider because I actually was raised, I was 10 when I came to live in the US. So, past my, right around the ending of my formative years. And so my first language is Spanish. I I'm grounded in a very different culture. So I'm an artist and I think like an artist. I have the soul of an artist. My earliest memories of myself was singing and dancing on the front porch in the Dominican Republic. And so I came in enamored of the arts. These are a few of my paintings. And I was telling Jim earlier about the story of winter. The tree in the center there is called Winter Tree. I also, I'm a sound therapist. I studied actually when I was a child to be an opera singer in New York and had the benefit of being trained by some really wonderful teachers at the American School of Music, women who taught and also trained at the Metropolitan Opera. So I had really good training. That then became translated as sound therapy many years later. I'm a Reiki Master and Teacher. I also teach meditation, and I've taught and will forever be a student of A Course in Miracles. My work is based actually on A Course in Miracles. I facilitated seminars on race and all kinds of different arenas. I am a race equity coach. And I have worked with corporate leaders as well as members of Congress and so on. As Jim mentioned earlier, I have written 4, actually now it's 5 books because my latest book, Cracking the Healer's Code, A Prescription for Healing Racism and Finding Wholeness, actually has a journal that goes with it. And so that way people can keep track of what they're feeling and learning and understanding. So one of the things that I realized from doing this work for so very, very long is that healing is the missing element to our race conversation. And a lot of people are starting to mention the word healing here and there. Racism is now being declared a public health crisis. So I'm encouraged by that after doing this work for more than 30 years. I'm encouraged that it's being talked about as a public health crisis, because then from that perspective, we can have a different conversation, one that's more centered on healing, one that's more centered on the pathology of race and the ways in which it impacts people. So what is healing? Healing is taking what's wrong, what's hurtful, what causes us pain, what's dysfunctional, and really bringing it into wholeness. Healing requires that we change our minds and our hearts. It requires that we do things differently, but mostly it requires that we understand. And if we're going to understand race, we need to become race literate. If we're going to heal, we need to understand trauma. We need to come at it with an open mind and an open heart because we don't know what we don't know. And we need to have the courage and the willingness to face the past that has created the present so that we can look at what we need to do differently in order to create a different future. My definition of race literacy is the knowledge and awareness of the history of race, how one is acculturated into a racial caste, the systems in the nation state that support race as a human divide, and the impact of all of the above on our current events and individual lives. If we're going to truly take a look at how we heal and how and why race is important, we need to understand trauma. We need to have some kind of information about what trauma is and how trauma works. We know from research that traumatized people traumatize others. How some people put it is, hurt people hurt people. Subsequent generations carry decontextualized trauma, and it is carried in their bodies because trauma is passed on epigenetically. Traumatized people tend to repeat history. And because the history looks slightly different in their current experience, they often don't see the connection between the past and the present. So if we are going to heal, we need to have an open mind and an open heart. And we need to have a willingness, as I said earlier, to face the past. So let's take a look at climate and how that impacts all of us in one form or another. So if we're going to think in terms of people who live in cold climates versus people who live in the equator and how folks develop, we need to look at the reality that folks in northern climates, in colder climates, have about 3 months to grow their food, right? If you have about 3 months to grow your food, and probably about 9 months out of the year, you look out into the world, your world, and there isn't even a leaf on a tree, except maybe for the evergreens, right? Your perception of the world tends to be one of, there's not enough. There's not enough. How are we going to make it through winter and into the next season, grow food, and have to wait to harvest it to eat again? So in order to be able to stay in climates like that, people had to be very good at certain things. They had to be very good at keeping track of time. Time is very important because if you miss the growing season, you're going to die, right? Preservation. You need to be able to preserve the grain so that it lasts you long enough to be able to eat through the entire season until you can grow some more and harvest grain again. You need to be able to count and measure is very, very important to you. And you want to be as precise as possible because you want to know how much grain you will need to feed the entire village and make sure that the grain lasts. So let's travel now to the equator. How long do those people have to grow their food? 365 days a year, there's always something growing. If the papaya is not growing, the mango's growing. If the mango's not growing, the avocado's in season. Something is always in season. When you look out into the world, it's green and lush. There are flowers growing throughout the entire year. So your perception of the world is that there's plenty. There's always lots to eat. There's always plenty to be had. So your perception of the world is very different. You tend to look at the world as, oh, there's plenty, there's a lot of abundance, and anyone who comes over to visit is treated like, you know, a king or a queen because there's always plenty. When we live in climates that require us to have very specific ways of being and being in our world, that way of being works really well in its own environment. It's when we force our ways onto other people whose ways are very different from our own because they too are living with their climate and what is around them. What I'm talking about right now is something called axiology. Axiology is the study of values based on culture and environment. And if you want to learn more about axiology, you want to look up Dr. Edwin Nichols. Dr. Nichols is a industrial psychologist, and he was very good at developing the theory of axiology, also now known as they've given it a different name, but basically axiology helps us to understand it's actually the study of values based on culture and environment. The reason I want you to have that in mind as I go through this presentation is because axiology continues to affect people today, and you'll see why. So I'm going to take us back to the 1400s, and I know that a lot of you know about the Doctrine of Discovery, so I won't go too deeply into it, but it's important to understand that the Doctrine of Discovery is actually responsible for the colonization of most of the world. It started early with the Prince of Portugal, Henry the Navigator, who was given the right to colonize the western coast of Africa as early as the 1450s. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that doctrine, because that doctrine is also what allowed Columbus to go out into the world, and no one teaches us that in school. I certainly didn't learn about the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, for those of you who may not know about it, the doctrine is a papal bull. It was created by the papacy, and it was to give permission to the Prince of Portugal, as I said earlier, to go out and colonize the coast of Africa. But it wasn't just colonization. It was to take ownership of the land, the waterways, the people's possessions, and the people, and to turn the people into perpetual slaves. So if we go back to Europe and we look at crime and punishment in Europe in the 1400s, things were pretty horrific. There was a lot of disease, because remember, there was no sanitation. People would be hung, sometimes 5, 6 people at one time, because somebody had stolen something, or somebody had stolen a piece of bread, or they were poaching on someone's land, and so on and so forth. Or because they had a different belief that didn't match what they were supposed to believe based on the papal bulls of the day, or what the Vatican had indicated they should be believing. So anyone who was not Catholic was under, and continues to be under, the Doctrine of Discovery, which means the Jews, the Islams, the Hindus, all under the Doctrine of Discovery. And if you're under the Doctrine of Discovery, that means that you're ripe to be colonized. So the people in Europe would turn out to see these beheadings and these hangings and these tortures en masse. Remember, they didn't have TV or radio, right? Like, that was considered entertainment by a lot of people. And if you didn't want to go out and look at these things, you were brought out by the soldiers to watch it. The idea was to use violence to traumatize. And you traumatize to destabilize. Traumatized people are destabilized. Destabilized people are easy to control. So it was traumatized to destabilize to control, so that the papacy and the monarchy could remain in power. So remember what I said earlier about traumatized people traumatize other, and how trauma gets passed down from one generation to another through epigenetics. So trauma became institutional. Trauma had been institutionalized for thousands and thousands of years, okay? And again, the reason was to destabilize, to be able to control people. And so when we look at the countries that were colonized, it's important to remember that you don't just go out and colonize for the sake of colonizing. You colonize because there's something there that you want to own. So it's either the natural resources, the human resources, or there's something on that land. And when I say natural resources, I'm talking food, right? Because now it's easier to get food, because this food in this area of the world grows 365 days a year versus not 3 months out of the year, right? And so you have food, you have gold, silver, diamonds. Eventually it became oil, and on and on and on. And so when people colonize, they don't colonize just to colonize. They colonize because there's something there that is of value to them. Okay. So we don't have enough time to do this video, so we're going to, well, let's see if we can get it to, I'm going to have you watch this very short video.
We already know that this is a gene that contributes to risk for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. When we looked at their own children also had an epigenetic change in the same spot on the stress-related gene.
So I'm going to talk about an experiment that was done some years back, and I call it, actually it's known as the cherry blossom experiment. So this group of scientists had mice in a cage, and they were pumping the fragrance of cherry blossom oil into the cage. Every time they pumped in the cherry blossom oil, they would electrocute the mice on their paws or whatever, their feet or whatever they're called, right? After a while, just like Pavlov's dogs, right? You didn't have to use the little electrical thing. All you had to do was pump in the oil and the mice would act traumatized. They found that the next generation acted more traumatized than the first generation. My theory is the first generation knows they're doing something to you, right? Something's happening. Second generation has no context. They don't know that. And so what the second generation has is decontextualized trauma. Every time they smell cherry blossom oil, they act out of the PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So they found that up to 6 generations had a reaction to the cherry blossom oil. If you add that to the first generation, that's 7 full generations of traumatized mice. We also know from studying survivors of war that the trauma and survivors, particularly survivors of the Holocaust, that trauma gets passed on from one generation to another. And if there is no healing and nothing is done about that trauma continues to get passed on from generation to generation. It is so much so that racism now lives in the body. And when Jim and I have our conversation, we're going to do a little exercise to help you find where racism actually lives in your body today. So what we have is institutionalized, colonization through the Doctrine of Discovery. And just as a reminder, the Doctrine of Discovery basically says that the European countries that were going out to colonize other countries could invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. So remember, if you weren't Catholic, you were considered a pagan, which meant that the Druids, the Celts, any religions based on nature, which is, by the way, what made for so many men and women to be burned as witches. Okay, goes right back to the doctrine. I mean, it's extraordinary how people haven't peeled back the layers yet, but we're starting to do that. So, other enemies of Christ whatsoever placed in the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, successors, and heirs, all goods, and to convert him or convert them to his or her profit. which is what allowed for human beings to be sold and through the Middle Passage. Now, let's just be clear about the fact that slavery is one of the oldest things that's been around, in our world. The thing about slavery is that there are different forms of slavery. Okay, this was very specific slavery. So part of this whole thing with the doctrine was that any land that was not Catholic at the time was considered terra nulla, which meant that, that nobody's inhabiting those lands, even though there were human beings inhabiting those lands. As I mentioned earlier, I was born in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic had Taínos and they had Carib people living there. And when Columbus came and did what he did throughout that land with incredible violence and killings and so on and so forth, and plus people were also perishing from diseases and those kinds of things. When he went back to Europe and he went back to Spain, and he took with him some Taínos. Some of them died on the way, but he had enough Taínos with him to prove that he had made it to India, right? Because his trip was supposed to be to India. And what he knew about Indians was that they had dark skin and straight jet black hair. And so he took Taínos thinking that, he had reached India. So anyway, he went back. But when he went back, he had with him gold, silver, he had food, he had all kinds of things. And so it was like the opening of, oh my goodness, there's gold in them, their islands, and them, their countries. And so after that, all of these other European countries joined this whole system, and they were all given permission by the Vatican to do so. So I'm gonna just say that it's important to remember that the doctrine of discovery not only affected Africa, but also Asia, North, Central, and South America. It's still being used in Australia, in the United States, in New Zealand. And that it's important to remember that the last time that the doctrine of discovery was used in the United States was 2005, and Justice Ginsburg used it to win a case against the Oneidas in New York. And you can get all that information on the web. So what does that mean to us today? And what does all of this stuff have to do with racism? So if we're going to really understand what is happening today based on what happened yesterday, we need to really be clear that the doctrine of discovery is still alive and well today. It basically means that human beings are the possession of other human beings. And it shows up in a lot of different ways throughout our culture, right? So I am going to skip over this video and I want to talk about how old systems are still affecting us. So if we're going to talk about the enslavement of Africans throughout North, Central, South America, we need to understand that these systems were very well established, and that we are all living, especially in this part of the world, we're living under a system that was established by the Spaniards. And that system is called Las Castas. Las Castas is a caste system. And the caste system was based on, it was the tracking of lineage. And the tracking of lineage based on inheritance, because remember, in the European system, only the firstborn male could inherit. And now you have all of these Europeans coming and settling on these islands and in these countries where there are native people living. The women are being raped. Sometimes relationships were consensual. But now all of these people are having children, right? And the Europeans needed to make it very, very clear that if a European male mated with a Native woman or an African woman, that if that firstborn male child, if that was a firstborn male child, that that child could not inherit. So they brought about their marital rights, which they had in Europe. And they were very specific about these marital rights in these colonized places. And basically what it said was that a child that was born outside of the marriage bond could not inherit. So now you have all these men having all these babies with all these women, and those children could not inherit. Those children were born outside of legal marriage, which meant that those children were illegal, or as they were known, illegitimate. This caste system was very specific. And because it was illegal for women and the enslaved and the natives to learn to read and write, they created this pictorial thing called las castas. And again, a picture tells 1,000 words, right? So in this pictorial system, the offspring of all the different combinations that they could think of race had different names. So 2 Europeans mating in marriage, because remember, if you're not married and you 2 Europeans, your child is illegitimate, right? So, and when they established this whole illegitimate thing, it basically meant that you had no human rights. That's what that meant, okay? And so, so you had the 2 Europeans mating, having a child. If it was in marriage, and that was the firstborn male, that child could inherit. If the child was born out of wedlock, that child could not inherit, which meant that all of these children that were being born from 2 natives, 2 Africans, an African and a native, an African and a European, an African, and you know, just any combination you can think of that were not 2 European heterosexual, those children were considered illegitimate, which meant that they had no human rights, which meant that they could be sold, they could be killed, anything could happen to these children. Because remember what the doctrine said. The doctrine said that they were property. And because they were property, they were treated as chattel, or, you know, it was like a piece of furniture. They did not have human rights. Fast forward, let me say this even before I move on from here, and that is that, as I mentioned earlier, all these children were given names, and most of them were given animal names. So a lot of people still use the word mulatto, but they don't know where that actually comes from. Mulatto comes from the word mule. What is it that a mule cannot do? A mule cannot reproduce. The message to the to European men, because, you know, people fall in love, right? So the message to them was, if you marry anyone who is not of your quote unquote race, and we all know that race is a myth, there are no genetic markers differentiating one human group from another human group, but the message to them was, if you marry outside of your race, that's the end of your lineage. Because one of the things that a mule cannot do is a mule cannot reproduce. So they were called mulatto because it meant the end of your lineage. So very specific, very clear messages. And, you know, in the US, a lot of people, because, you know, we come from all different parts of the world, and there are people in the US that say, well, my family had nothing to do with slavery because we just got here, right? And the truth is that if you had family that was in the world during the time of the enslavement of particularly the Africans and the natives, then your family was complicit. And if you're here now, you got family that goes back to them, Okay, it goes back to then. Everybody was complicit. Everybody who used sugar, everybody who wore cotton clothing, everybody who ate oranges and fruits that came from these places, everybody was complicit. And it was considered natural and it was considered okay. And the other thing that we never talk about is how Europeans were enslaved. They were enslaved before the Africans. In fact, they had perfected the system so well that that's what allowed them to do what they did with the Africans. So in Europe, you had indentured slaves, you had poor, and you had slaves. And there's a wonderful book that was written in 1995 that's called They Were White and They Were Slaves. The first enslaved people in North America were white people. They were brought over on the ships that were coming over, bringing the Europeans, because they had slaves. So they would bring their slaves with them. The difference was that because they looked European, they could get on the ships, go back, start life somewhere else, and and they'd be fine. So so the whole world was complicit around this stuff. Let's see, I'm going to show you just a short video, if we can get it to do what it's supposed to do, about slavery in Rhode Island. There we go.
My DeWolf ancestors were known as the Great Folk in Bristol. There were professors and writers, artists and architects, and many Episcopal ministers. I was proud to be related to them. I was also drawn to this fairy tale world of old New England, these images of my grandparents when they were young. It never occurred to me to ask how we got so established. One day, my grandmother traced back. I was in seminary when I got a booklet in the mail that she wrote for all her grandchildren. She shared our family history, all the happy days. She also explained that the first DeWolf, Mark Anthony, came to Bristol as a sailor in 1744. And then she wrote, I hadn't stomach enough to describe the ensuing slave trade. What hit me hard was the realization that I already knew this. Knew, but somehow buried it along the way. What no one in my family realized was that the DeWolfs were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. They brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains. 500,000 of their descendants could be alive today.
Okay, so take a nice deep breath, and I'm going to stop sharing. Jim, I'm going to invite you to come back, and I would like for us to do the exercise that I spoke about earlier, which is the exercise to see if you can feel where racism may be living in your body. And so what I'm going to do is have all who are listening to please take a nice deep breath and blow it out. And if you're holding anything in your hands, just put it down. And if it helps you to focus, close your eyes. And I want you to notice your feet, and notice where your feet are on the floor. Notice how your feet feel on the floor or in your shoes or in your socks. And just be aware of the feeling on your skin. Take a nice deep breath, blow it out, and bring your attention to your bottom. And notice how your bottom feels on the chair where you're sitting, or if you're lying down. And just notice. Nice deep breath. Blow it out. And I want you to become aware of your head and your face. And just notice how you feel, how your head feels, how your face feels. Nice deep breath. Blow it out. And now I want you to bring your awareness to the center of your chest. And just notice how your heart is beating. See if you notice anything else in your body. Nice deep breath. And get centered in the center of your chest. And simply say to yourself, without speaking a word, say this silently to yourself. Racism. Racism. And see if you notice your body and what's happening in your body. Racism. Take a nice deep breath. Blow it out. And simply say to yourself, staying centered in your chest, peace. Peace. And just be aware of your body and notice if there are any changes. Peace. Take a nice deep breath. Blow it out. And Jim, I will ask you, because I can't see anyone else on our call today, if you notice a difference between the word racism and the word peace in your body.
Indeed. I was following your instructions, and when I internally said the word racism, I felt my heart constrict. And I felt kind of sorrow, and immediately remembered my first exposure as a young boy. It was the Watts riots in 1965 was my first kind of exposure. I'd been raised in the Orient in Taiwan, and we were heading back to the States, and it was in the news. And it was the first time my father explained, that there was this racial situation in America. And I immediately remembered that. And then when you said the words peace, the word peace, I relaxed, and I felt more benign and more compassionate. So that was my experience.
Thank you. Not unlike the experience of most people. Most people feel racism somewhere in their bodies. Some feel it in their chest, some in their throat, some in their heads and their stomach and so on. And it always feels like it's constricted energy, like nothing's moving kind of thing, where with the word peace, there is this release that people feel. And the reason I have people do that exercise is not just to help them be aware that racism lives in their body, and which, by the way, is how and why people get so triggered around the word race and racism, because it triggers a stress response. It's fight, flight, or paralysis, because it feels constricted, and it does all these things to your body. But also because understanding that this lives in our body is part of the epigenetic traumatic pass down of racism. And we don't ever really think about that or really talk about it from that perspective. And that is such an important perspective for us to have, that there is this thing that comes from a myth. We talked a little bit about how race is a myth. There are no genetic markers differentiating one human group from another human group. But out of this myth has come this very real thing that we all experience called racism. And it permeates everything: education, housing, government, you name it, it permeates everything. And if we don't become aware that there are 5 levels of racial conditioning that are living in our bodies, it's institutional, which means it was made into law. It's systemic, which means that there are systems that are put in place to make sure that the laws are adhered to. It's institutional, systemic, internalized, because we live with it everywhere. It becomes personal. And then we interact with each other out of that, what we have internalized. So it's institutional, systemic, internalized, and personal and interpersonal. For the most part, we want to solve racism from the interpersonal perspective. That is the last place where racism is lodged, because we need to consider that we live the laws, right? Starting with the Doctrine of Discovery and then moving right on down to, the Land Act, the this and that, you name it, and you can trace it back to that, right? Then there are systems that we've put in place that follow these laws, right? So we have educational system, we have the judicial system, we have all these systems that are under these laws. And as a result of living in these systems, we internalize what is there. So I tell people that racism is not the fault of anyone living today, but it is our collective responsibility to heal it and transform it, so that we don't leave it to another generation, that we need to start leaving less and less and less, so that eventually people will look back at us and go, wow, those people really didn't have it together, right? because they will have figured it out, right? But we need to do the work that is ours to do in this generation right here, right now, so that we can make a difference, a lasting difference in this thing that we call racism.
Well, thank you. We're just about at time, so we don't have the scope to get into much of a dialogue, but I would just ask you one quick question, Milagros, in a few minutes we've got left. And that is as you understand the history of race and the contemporary manifestations of race, which, under the Trump administration and the current Republican Party are being exacerbated in ways that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. But also there's the upsurge of critical race theory and the impulse in the educational system to own it in a much deeper way. So as you understand race today, what for you is sort of the frontier or cutting edge that, if you were advising our thousands of people in our community watching this right now, what would be your advice as to the one thing they could do or understand or not do that would contribute to enhanced racial literacy?
Yeah, well, I was going to say become race literate, because the race literate understand that critical race theory is something that is not being taught in first grade, kindergarten, K through 12, or even in college. Critical race theory is something that was created by Dr. Crenshaw in the 1970s for law schools to help people unravel and understand the institutional and systemic part of racism. So it's not something that's being taught in school, but it is a handy little catchphrase for those who want to use it politically. And so, so the first thing I would tell people, and the main thing I would tell people, is look to become race literate. Learn as much as you can about race. Stop hiding from the shadow of our past or of our history, because as long as we hide from the shadow, that means that the shadow owns us. When we face that shadow, we own it, and we decide what to do with that shadow. And so, so those are the two main things that I would tell people: is become race literate, which means learn about the history of race and understand it, and become proficient in having conversations on race that don't lead to fights and arguments and about who's right and who's wrong. The reality is we need to be able to have civil conversations about this stuff. We need to be able to talk about it so that we can begin to transform it. We have so much power. We human beings are extraordinary. We can do anything we set our minds to. And change doesn't have to take that long. We've seen that in the past 2 years. Things have changed drastically in the past year and a half, and which tells us that we can make big changes, sweeping changes very quickly if we are all in agreement. And so becoming race literate, I think, is the main thing. In fact, since the death of George Floyd, I've been doing a Monday program, which now is going to be a monthly program called Race Literacy Lunch and Learn. And in fact, that's what I'm rushing to go do. And that's my next big appointment today, which we've been doing. And now we're doing it the first Monday of every month at 12 noon. It's powerful when people can have these conversations with each other without getting into these fights and arguments. And it's important for us to learn to do that and to model it for our children so that they too can have these conversations in a way that is compassionate, in a way that is understanding, in a way that is humble.
Yeah. And under current circumstances, with so much divisiveness stalking the land in the United States, that is a challenge in and of itself, to be able to sit down on some of these very deeply divisive issues and do so in a spirit of compassion and inclusiveness. That's part of race literacy, actually. It's just how to have the conversation.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say is it's important for us to understand that if we're going to do healing work, that we need to treat the whole being. It's mind, body, spirit, and emotions, because as you can tell just by what it does to your body, just by doing that little exercise, right? You're not engaged in an argument or anything like that. Just the word triggers us, right? And so there's compassion that's needed, and healing is desperately needed. So please remember that as you're having these conversations with friends and family.
Milagros, thank you so much. I hope to have you back down the trail when we can be a little bit more expansive. You've raised very deep issues, and I think all of us would like to know more. And because race is up for humanity right now in a way that it hasn't been in a very, very long time, probably since the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and we need to pay attention to it. And you're one of the people out there that is leading the way. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone would like to know more about my work, they can just go to milagrosphillips.com, www.milagrosphillips.com. And
and just say the title of your recent books.
Yes, it's the last one is Cracking the Healer's Code, a compassionate, Cracking the Healer's Code. And before that, there's I just love it. It's sort of like last minute, let's just do this, right? 11 Reasons to Become Race Literate was my first book. My second book is 8 Essentials to a Race Conversation. Third one is Speaking Race in Healthcare, and Cracking the Healer's Code is my last book. And you can find them all on the web.
Good. Thank you so much, Milagros Phillips, everyone. And that brings us to a close for today. Milagros needs to move on. So I want to thank you all for joining us. You're all welcome to the After Chat group. If you can, there, Stanley just put the link in the chat box. And if you can make it, you're welcome. If not, we'll see you here again tomorrow with Andrew Harvey for a discourse on the great mystical poet of India, 15th century India, Kabir. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.